My name is Vernon Kowalski, and I'm a laundry worker at Metro Hospital Services in Detroit. On October 15th, 2024, I was processing contaminated hospital linens when the zombie outbreak began. What I thought was just another night shift became a fight for survival when infected hospital staff started showing up at my facility. The dirty laundry I'd been cleaning all night had been spreading the virus across the city, and I was ground zero. Before we start the video, let us know what country you are tuning in from in the comment section below. Perhaps we will make a story there. Let's begin. My name is Vernon Kowalski, and for 18 years I worked the night shift at Metro Hospital Services in Detroit. Most people never knew my job existed. While the city slept, I processed thousands of pounds of contaminated medical linens from 12 different hospitals across the metro area. Blood-soaked sheets from emergency rooms, surgical gowns from operating theaters, isolation ward materials from infectious disease units. Everything that couldn't be thrown away, but was too dangerous for regular cleaning ended up in my facility. I learned to read Detroit's pain through its dirty laundry. A busy Friday night meant more gunshot wounds and car accidents. Flu season brought mountains of isolation linens. Summer heat waves filled our bins with dehydration cases and heat stroke victims. After nearly 2 decades, I could predict the city's health just by looking at what rolled through our loading dock each evening. That skill would save my life. My facility sat in an industrial complex on Detroit's east side, connected to the city's major medical centers through a network of service tunnels most people never knew existed. The building was nothing special from the outside, just another concrete box with loading docks and utility connections. Inside, it housed some of the most sophisticated cleaning equipment in the Midwest. Massive Milner washers that could handle 800 pounds of contaminated materials per cycle. Chemical dispensing systems that mixed industrial-grade disinfectants with precision. Steam sterilization units that reached temperatures hot enough to kill any known pathogen. I worked alone by choice. The night shift paid better, and I preferred the solitude. Tommy Chen handled the day shift, managing deliveries and coordinating with hospital administrators. Good guy, always had a joke ready when we crossed paths during shift changes. But once 10 o'clock rolled around and Tommy headed home to his family, the facility belonged to me. My routine was methodical, developed over years of handling biohazardous materials. First, I'd review the delivery schedule and sort incoming bins by contamination level. Red tags meant high-risk materials from isolation wards and surgical suites. Yellow tags were standard emergency room linens. Green tags came from general medical floors. Each category required different handling procedures, different chemical treatments, different processing temperatures. Safety protocols were everything in my line of work. One mistake, one breach of containment, and you could walk out of the facility carrying any number of diseases. I'd seen coworkers over the years get careless with bloodborne pathogens. Hepatitis, HIV, antibiotic-resistant infections. The hospitals trusted us to break the chain of transmission, to ensure that clean linens going back into circulation were truly sterile. I took that responsibility seriously, maybe more seriously than I should have. Tuesday night, October 15th, started like any other shift. I arrived at the facility at 10:30, letting myself in through the service entrance with my security card. The loading dock was already full. 47 bins instead of the usual 30, each one tagged and logged by the day shift. Tommy had left me a note saying Detroit General had called for an emergency pickup, something about a sudden influx of patients in their infectious disease ward. I didn't think much of it at first. Hospitals had surges all the time. Food poisoning outbreaks, seasonal flu spikes, contaminated water supplies. My job wasn't to ask questions about what filled those bins. My job was to make sure whatever came out of them was clean enough to use again. But as I started sorting through the delivery, I noticed patterns that didn't fit the usual categories. The concentration of red-tagged bins from Detroit General was unusually high. Emergency room materials made up nearly 60% of the total volume, far above the normal distribution. Most concerning were the isolation ward linens. I'd processed infectious disease materials before, but this batch had a smell that cut right through our industrial-grade air filtration system. The blood was different too. In 18 years, I'd seen every type of blood stain imaginable. Fresh surgical bleeding was bright red and flowed in predictable patterns. Trauma blood was darker, often mixed with dirt or debris. Nosebleeds left distinctive splatter marks. Internal bleeding created deep, rust-colored stains that spread slowly through fabric. This blood was almost black, with a consistency that seemed wrong. It didn't behave like normal blood when exposed to our pretreatment chemicals. Instead of breaking down and lifting away from the fabric, it seemed to resist the cleaning agents. Some stains actually appeared to get darker when treated with hydrogen peroxide, the opposite of what should happen. I'd gotten good at reading trauma patterns over the years. Gunshot wounds left specific blood spray configurations. Knife wounds created linear stains with clear directionality. Blunt force trauma produced broader, more diffuse patterns. But the linens from Detroit General that night showed something I'd never encountered before. Bite marks. Not animal bites, which I'd seen occasionally from emergency veterinary overflow. These were human bite patterns, but more severe than typical assault cases. The tears in the fabric suggested desperate, sustained attacks. Multiple bite locations on single garments. Tissue damage that went far beyond what you'd expect from a normal human bite. I found myself spending more time than usual examining individual pieces, trying to understand what could cause such unusual trauma patterns. The surgical gowns were particularly disturbing. Several showed bite marks directly over the neck and shoulder areas, with corresponding blood patterns that suggested the attacks had occurred while the victims were lying down. Hospital beds, maybe, or gurneys. The radio chatter from our delivery drivers was more active than normal too. We maintained contact with the crews that picked up and delivered linens throughout the metro area. Usually, the overnight frequencies were quiet except for routine check-ins. But that Tuesday night, I kept hearing fragments of urgent conversations. Drivers reporting delays at pickup locations. Requests for additional security escorts. One driver from Beaumont Hospital asked for permission to skip his scheduled stop at Detroit General entirely. I tried calling Jimmy Martinez around midnight. Jimmy worked security at Detroit General and usually coordinated our pickup runs personally. We developed a good working relationship over the years. He understood the importance of proper containment protocols and always made sure his staff followed procedures when loading our trucks. But Jimmy's radio went straight to voicemail, which was unusual for him. The phone system at Detroit General wasn't responding either. I tried the main switchboard, the emergency department, even the housekeeping supervisor's direct line. Every call went to automated messaging systems. For a major hospital to have communication problems during overnight hours suggested either technical failures or something more serious. Sirens were constant in the distance, more than usual for a Tuesday night, even in Detroit. The sound seemed to be coming from multiple directions, concentrated around the medical district where most of my client hospitals were located. Fire department, police, ambulances, all converging on the same general area where I'd been collecting contaminated materials all evening. I kept working through my standard procedures, but the unease was building. 23 years of night shift work teaches you to trust your instincts when something feels off. The facility felt too quiet despite the humming machinery. The service tunnel ventilation system carried sounds from the connected medical complex, and normally I could hear the ambient noise of hospital operations. Elevators moving between floors, mechanical systems cycling, the distant sound of emergency department activity. That night, the tunnels were silent, By 2 in the morning, I was processing the highest-risk materials from Detroit General's isolation ward. The smell was overwhelming despite my respirator and the facility's air filtration systems. It wasn't the usual hospital odors of disinfectant and illness. This was something organic and wrong, like meat left too long in hot weather. The industrial washers seemed to struggle with the load, requiring multiple cycles to achieve normal cleanliness standards. I found myself checking the service tunnel access more frequently than usual. The heavy steel door that connected our facility to the underground network was always locked from our side, but I kept hearing sounds that might have been footsteps echoing through the corridors. Maintenance workers sometimes used the tunnels during overnight hours for repairs and utility work, but they were supposed to notify security before accessing the system. The delivery schedule showed Jimmy Martinez was supposed to pick up processed linens from our facility at 3 in the morning. Clean materials going back to Detroit General for morning shift use. But 3 o'clock came and went with no sign of his truck. I tried his radio again and got static. His cell phone went straight to voicemail. By 3:30, Jimmy was officially late. In 5 years of coordinating pickups, he'd never missed a scheduled run without calling ahead. Detroit General's morning shift would be expecting their clean linens before the day staff arrived. Operating rooms couldn't function without sterile drapes and gowns. Emergency departments needed constant supplies of clean sheets and blankets. I was starting to consider calling Tommy Chen at home when I heard footsteps in the service corridor outside the main facility. Heavy boots on concrete, moving slowly but steadily toward our entrance. Had to be Jimmy, finally arriving for his pickup. Probably had truck trouble or got delayed by whatever emergency was keeping the hospital communications down. But the footsteps didn't have a rhythm. They shuffled irregularly, like someone having trouble walking. I'd seen Jimmy move with the confident stride of a security professional for years. These steps sounded uncertain, almost stumbling. I called out his name as I headed toward the service entrance. The facility's loading dock was on the opposite side of the building, but Jimmy sometimes used the service door when he needed to coordinate unusual pickups or discuss schedule changes. The door had a security camera, but the monitor was in Tommy's office and I hadn't bothered to check it. "Jimmy, that you? You're running pretty late tonight." No response. The footsteps continued moving closer to the door, but whoever was out there didn't answer my call. Maybe he couldn't hear me through the heavy steel construction. The service entrance was designed to maintain containment protocols, with multiple barriers between the outside corridors and our processing areas. I reached for the door controls, following standard security procedures. First, check the external camera feed, then verify identity before disengaging the locks. Our facility handled enough dangerous materials that unauthorized access could create serious contamination risks. The security monitor showed a figure in a Detroit General security uniform standing just outside the door. The camera angle made it difficult to see details, but the uniform looked torn and disheveled. One arm hung at an unnatural angle, like it had been dislocated or broken. But it was definitely Jimmy's badge on the shirt pocket. Something was wrong with his posture, though. Jimmy was a big guy, probably 6'2" and built like he'd played football in high school. But the figure on the monitor seemed smaller somehow, hunched over like he was having trouble standing upright. His head was tilted at an odd angle, and he seemed to be swaying slightly. I hesitated with my hand on the door release. Every safety protocol I'd learned over 18 years said to verify identity and condition before allowing access to contaminated areas. But this was Jimmy Martinez, someone I'd worked with for years. If he was hurt or in trouble, leaving him outside could make things worse. The figure on the monitor raised its head slightly, and I caught a glimpse of something that made my blood run cold. Jimmy's eyes were completely white, like cataracts had formed instantly. But that was impossible. I'd seen him just last week during a routine pickup, and his vision had been fine. I was still trying to process what I was seeing when the figure began pounding on the service door. Not the controlled knocking of someone requesting entry, but desperate, frantic hammering like someone trying to break through. The steel door was built to withstand industrial accidents and contamination breaches. It would take serious equipment to damage it, but the pounding continued, growing more violent with each impact. Whatever was happening to Jimmy, he wasn't thinking clearly. Maybe he'd been exposed to something in the hospital. Chemical exposure could cause neurological symptoms. Head trauma could explain the balance problems and confusion. I reached for the facility phone to call for medical assistance, but before I could dial, the pounding stopped. The monitor showed the figure had stepped back from the door and was now facing the camera directly. Even through the grainy black and white feed, I could see that something was fundamentally wrong with Jimmy Martinez. His face was slack and expressionless, but his mouth hung open in a way that didn't look natural. Dark stains covered the front of his uniform, concentrated around the neck and chest areas. The badge that had identified him as Detroit General Security was partially torn away, hanging by a single clip. But it was his eyes that made me step away from the door controls. Those white, milky orbs weren't focusing on anything. They seemed to be looking through the camera rather than at it, like he couldn't see but was somehow aware of my presence on the other side of the door. The silence stretched for several long seconds. I found myself holding my breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Part of me wanted to open the door and help someone who might be seriously injured. But every instinct developed over years of handling dangerous materials was screaming warnings about contamination and safety protocols. That's when I heard more footsteps in the service corridor. Multiple sets this time, all with that same irregular shuffling gait. The security monitor showed additional figures moving into camera range. More Detroit General staff based on their uniforms. Nurses, orderlies, what looked like a doctor in surgical scrubs. All of them had the same white eyes. All of them moved with that same unnatural, stumbling motion. And all of them were stained with dark substances that could have been blood or something worse. I backed away from the service entrance, my mind racing to understand what I was seeing. Some kind of chemical exposure at the hospital, maybe. Mass poisoning from contaminated supplies or a ventilation system failure. That would explain the communication blackouts and the emergency response activity I'd been hearing all night, but it didn't explain why they were all converging on my facility. Or why Jimmy Martinez had been pounding on the door like he was trying to get inside rather than seeking help. The group outside had grown to at least 6 people, all wearing Detroit General uniforms, all exhibiting the same disturbing symptoms. They began moving toward the service entrance in a coordinated fashion that suggested some level of awareness and purpose. Whatever was affecting them hadn't completely destroyed their cognitive functions. I realized I needed to contact emergency services immediately. If there had been a mass exposure event at Detroit General, medical authorities needed to know. The contaminated linens I'd been processing all night could be connected to whatever was making these people sick. As I reached for the emergency phone, the pounding on the service door resumed. But this time it wasn't just Jimmy Martinez. All 6 figures were hitting the door simultaneously, creating a thunderous rhythm that echoed through the facility. The steel construction held, but the violence of their assault was far beyond what injured hospital workers should have been capable of. I dialed 911 and waited for the connection. The line rang twice before a dispatcher answered, but the voice was harried and stressed. Emergency services, what's your location and nature of emergency? This is Vernon Kowalski at Metro Hospital Services on Detroit's East Side. I have multiple Detroit General Hospital staff outside my facility exhibiting signs of serious medical distress. They appear to be confused and possibly contaminated with hazardous materials. Sir, we're receiving multiple reports of incidents at Detroit General Hospital. Emergency medical teams are responding, but there may be significant delays. Are you in immediate danger? Before I could answer, the pounding on the service door intensified. The dispatcher could probably hear it through the phone connection. They're trying to break into a biohazard processing facility. I'm not sure what's wrong with them, but they're not responding to verbal communication and they're exhibiting unusual behavior. Sir, I need you to secure your location and avoid contact with potentially contaminated individuals. Do not allow access to your facility until emergency teams arrive. The line went dead. Whether the call had been disconnected or the dispatcher had moved on to other emergencies, I was now alone with whatever was happening outside my service entrance. The pounding continued for several more minutes before gradually subsiding. When I checked the security monitor again, the corridor appeared empty. The figures in Detroit General uniforms had disappeared, leaving behind only dark stains on the concrete floor where they had been standing. I tried calling Tommy Chen's home number, hoping to get advice from someone who understood our facility's security procedures. But Tommy's phone went straight to voicemail too. Either the entire communication system was failing, or something much more serious was affecting the city's infrastructure. The isolation I'd always valued during night shift work suddenly felt dangerous. I was alone in a facility filled with potentially contaminated materials, with no reliable communication to the outside world, and clear evidence that something catastrophic was happening at one of our major client hospitals. I began reviewing emergency procedures, looking for protocols that covered mass contamination events or facility security breaches. But our training had focused on individual exposure incidents and equipment failures. Nothing in the manual addressed situations where hospital staff might be contaminated and attempting forced entry. The industrial washers continued their cycles, processing the last loads of materials from Detroit General's isolation ward. In a few hours, those clean linens would be ready for pickup and return to the hospital. But based on what I just witnessed, I wasn't sure Detroit General was still functioning as a medical facility. I needed to understand what was happening before making any decisions about continuing normal operations. The contaminated materials I'd been processing all night could be connected to whatever was affecting the hospital staff. If there had been some kind of outbreak or exposure event, my facility might be part of the contamination pathway. As I started reviewing the evening's processing logs, looking for anything unusual in the materials I'd handled, I heard new sounds from the service tunnel system. Not the shuffling footsteps of the hospital staff, but mechanical noises. Ventilation fans cycling on and off. Elevator motors running between floors. The normal background sounds of a functioning medical complex. Except the sounds were wrong. Too frequent, too random, like systems were operating without coordination or control. Emergency generators cycling on and off, water pumps running continuously. The kind of mechanical chaos that suggested either massive system failures or facilities operating without human oversight. I realized that whatever was happening at Detroit General, it was probably spreading through the connected medical complex. And my facility, with its service tunnel access and direct connection to the hospital network, was potentially in the path of whatever crisis was developing. The processed linens from Detroit General sat in rolling bins, ready for morning pickup, clean, sterile, and completely safe according to every test and protocol we used. But I was starting to suspect that the contamination I'd been dealing with all night wasn't responding to normal sterilization procedures. In 18 years of processing medical waste, I'd learned to trust the science of industrial cleaning. Heat, chemicals, and time could eliminate any known pathogen. But what if we were dealing with something unknown? What if the contamination wasn't biological in the traditional sense? The service tunnel access remained secure, but I could hear movement in the corridors beyond our facility. Not the shuffling footsteps of the hospital staff, but something else. Dragging sounds, like heavy objects being pulled across concrete floors. Intermittent banging, like doors being forced open or equipment being overturned. I checked our facility systems to make sure everything was secure. Emergency protocols engaged, ventilation systems isolated from external connections, chemical storage areas locked down. If contaminated individuals were moving through the service tunnels, they wouldn't be able to access our processing areas without triggering multiple security barriers. But I was beginning to realize that security barriers might not be enough to handle whatever crisis was developing. The hospital staff I'd seen outside weren't behaving like people seeking help or trying to escape danger. They were behaving like people with a specific purpose, trying to gain access to something inside my facility. As I tried to make sense of the evening's events, I heard footsteps approaching the service entrance again. Slower this time, more deliberate. I checked the security monitor and saw a single figure in a Detroit General Nurse's uniform standing directly in front of the camera. Unlike the others, this person seemed more aware of their surroundings. They looked directly into the camera lens as if they knew I was watching. Their eyes were the same milky white as the others, but there was something different about their expression, more focused, more intent. The figure raised one hand and began tapping on the service door. Not the violent pounding of before, but a steady, rhythmic knocking, like someone politely requesting entry. But the politeness felt wrong, like a predator mimicking normal behavior to gain access to prey. I found myself backing away from the service entrance again, every survival instinct telling me that opening that door would be a catastrophic mistake. Whatever was affecting the Detroit General staff, it wasn't something that could be helped with first aid or medical attention. The knocking continued for several minutes before stopping abruptly. When I checked the monitor again, the corridor was empty, but I could hear sounds of movement throughout the service tunnel system, suggesting that more people were entering the underground network. I needed to make a decision about whether to continue normal operations or implement emergency shutdown procedures. The clean linens ready for pickup represented hours of work and thousands of dollars in processing costs. But returning potentially contaminated materials to a hospital that might no longer be functioning safely could make whatever crisis was developing much worse. As I weighed my options, I heard the most disturbing sound yet from the service tunnels. Human voices, but not speaking in any language I recognized. Guttural, wordless sounds that might have been attempts at communication. Multiple voices, coming from different directions in the tunnel network. The sounds were getting closer to our facility, and I realized that whatever was happening to the Detroit General staff was probably spreading through the entire medical complex. My isolated night shift position, which had always felt safe and secure, was now putting me directly in the path of something I didn't understand. I began implementing emergency lockdown procedures, securing all access points, and isolating our facility systems from external connections. But as I worked through the checklist, I couldn't shake the feeling that standard emergency protocols weren't going to be adequate for whatever I was about to face. The voices in the service tunnels were getting louder and more numerous, and they were all heading in the direction of my facility. The voices in the service tunnels were getting closer, and I knew I had to make a choice. Stay locked inside the facility and hope the emergency barriers would hold, or find another way out before whatever was happening in those corridors reached me. I'd been processing contaminated materials from Detroit General all night, and now the source of that contamination was literally at my doorstep. I decided to check the main loading dock, thinking maybe I could reach one of our delivery trucks and get away from the facility entirely. But as I moved through the processing area toward the dock entrance, I heard the unmistakable sound of the service door being forced open behind me. The emergency locks were electronic, designed to fail secure in case of power loss or system malfunction. It should have been impossible to breach them without the proper codes or physical tools. But the sound of twisting metal suggested that whoever was trying to get in wasn't using conventional methods. I grabbed the emergency radio from its charging station and tried to contact our dispatch center. Static filled the channel, mixed with fragments of panicked transmissions from drivers throughout the metro area. Something about roadblocks and evacuation routes. References to Detroit General that cut off mid-sentence. One driver reporting that his pickup location was completely dark, with no staff responding to radio calls. The service door finally gave way with a grinding crash that echoed through the facility. I could hear footsteps entering our sterile processing area, multiple sets moving with that same shuffling gait I'd observed on the security monitors. But they were inside now, past all the containment barriers that were supposed to protect both us and the outside world from cross-contamination. I shut down the main power to the processing equipment, hoping to eliminate any attractive sounds or lighting that might draw attention to my location. The massive washers wound down with mechanical groans, and the facility's ambient lighting switched to emergency power. Red exit signs cast an eerie glow over equipment that suddenly looked alien and threatening in the dim illumination. Moving as quietly as possible, I made my way toward the chemical storage area. If these people were contaminated with some kind of infectious agent, industrial disinfectants might be my only defense. I'd spent years learning the proper handling procedures for substances that could dissolve organic matter or neutralize biological threats. That knowledge was about to become more important than any safety certification I'd ever earned. The footsteps were spreading throughout the facility now, and I could hear them investigating different areas with what sounded like systematic thoroughness. Not the random wandering of confused or injured people, but purposeful searching, like they were looking for something specific or someone specific. I reached the chemical storage room and quickly reviewed my options. Concentrated bleach solutions that could burn through organic tissue. Ammonia compounds that created toxic vapors when mixed with other cleaning agents. Industrial hydrogen peroxide that hospitals used for sterilization and wound cleaning. All of them dangerous to handle without proper protection, but potentially effective against biological contamination. As I gathered supplies, I heard voices from the main processing area. Not the guttural sounds I'd been hearing through the service tunnels, but actual speech. Fragments of conversation that almost sounded normal, except for the flat, emotionless tone and the fact that I could make out individual words. Clean linens, one voice said, clear enough that I could understand despite the distance and intervening walls. Processing area, schedule. Another voice responded with what might have been Jimmy Martinez, though the inflection was completely wrong. Pick up 3 o'clock, still here. They were talking about our normal operations. Somehow, whatever was affecting these people hadn't completely destroyed their memories of routine procedures. They knew about pickup schedules and processing areas because they'd been part of the system that depended on our services. That realization was more disturbing than if they'd been completely mindless. This suggested that whatever contamination I was dealing with preserved certain cognitive functions while destroying others. They remembered their jobs and responsibilities, but they'd lost something essential about their humanity. I filled several spray bottles with concentrated disinfectant solutions, creating portable weapons that could be deployed quickly if I encountered direct threats. The chemicals would cause severe tissue damage on contact, but they'd also create vapor clouds that might force attackers to maintain distance. I'd never imagined using industrial cleaning supplies as defensive weapons, but 18 years of safety training had taught me exactly how dangerous these substances could be. The voices in the processing area were getting closer to the chemical storage room. I could hear them moving through equipment areas with increasing confidence, like they were becoming familiar with the facility layout. Soon they'd work their way through the entire building and discover my location. I needed to find an alternate exit route, but the facility had been designed with limited access points to maintain contamination control. The main loading dock was on the opposite side of the building, from the chemical storage area, requiring me to cross through spaces that were now occupied by infected hospital staff. That's when I remembered the emergency ventilation shaft that connected our facility to the main hospital complex. It was designed to provide air circulation during chemical exposure incidents, with access panels large enough for maintenance workers to service the system. I'd never used it personally, but Tommy Chen had mentioned it during safety briefings as an alternate evacuation route. The access panel was located in a utility closet adjacent to the chemical storage room. I gathered my improvised weapons and whatever protective equipment I could carry, then forced open the utility closet door. The ventilation shaft opening was about 3 feet square, large enough for a person to crawl through, but small enough to be easily overlooked by anyone not familiar with the facility's maintenance systems. As I prepared to enter the shaft, I heard footsteps approaching the chemical storage area. They'd found my location through systematic searching, and I was running out of time to escape. I pulled myself into the ventilation system just as someone began trying to force open the storage room door. The shaft was larger than I'd expected, with enough clearance to move on hands and knees without difficulty. Emergency lighting strips provided minimal illumination, showing a straight passage that extended toward the main hospital complex. Fresh air was flowing through the system, which meant the ventilation fans were still operating despite whatever chaos was happening in the medical facilities. Behind me, I could hear the chemical storage room being searched, containers being moved, equipment being examined. The infected hospital staff were thorough in their investigation, but they didn't seem to understand that I'd found an alternate escape route. As long as I could move quietly through the ventilation system, I might be able to reach the main hospital complex and find other survivors or emergency responders. The shaft extended for about 50 yards before branching into multiple passages that served different areas of the medical complex. I could hear mechanical sounds through the ventilation grills, suggesting that at least some hospital systems were still functioning. Emergency generators, water pumps, elevator motors. The infrastructure that kept a major medical facility operational was still running, even if the human staff had been compromised. I chose the passage that seemed to lead toward the main hospital building, hoping to find security personnel or administrators who might have information about what was happening. But as I crawled through the shaft, I began to smell something that made me question whether reaching the main facility was a good idea. The odor was organic and wrong, like the smell that had been coming from the contaminated linens all night, but concentrated and amplified. It was getting stronger as I moved toward the hospital, suggesting that whatever contamination I'd been processing was far more widespread than individual patient cases. Through ventilation grills, I could see into hospital corridors that should have been busy with night shift activity. Instead, they were eerily quiet and dimly lit, with emergency lighting casting long shadows across empty nursing stations and abandoned equipment. Occasionally, I'd see movement in the distance, figures in hospital uniforms moving with that same shambling gait I'd observed at my facility. I reached a junction where the ventilation shaft connected to the main hospital's air handling system. From this vantage point, I could see into multiple areas of the medical complex through different grills and access points. What I saw made me understand that this wasn't an isolated contamination incident or localized emergency. The entire hospital was compromised. Emergency departments that should have been treating casualties were empty, except for infected staff members wandering aimlessly through treatment areas. Operating rooms stood vacant, with surgical equipment abandoned mid-procedure. Patient rooms showed signs of violent struggle, with overturned furniture and dark stains on walls and floors. But most disturbing were the areas where groups of infected individuals had gathered. They weren't random assemblies, but organized clusters focused on specific activities. Some were concentrated around pharmaceutical storage areas, though they didn't seem to be consuming medications. Others had gathered in laboratory spaces, standing motionless around equipment they'd once operated as functioning medical professionals. It was like they retained muscle memory of their former jobs and responsibilities, but without the cognitive ability to actually perform those functions. They remembered being in these spaces and working with this equipment, but they'd lost the mental capacity to understand why or how. Through one grill, I could see into the hospital's main communication center. The radio equipment was still operational, with indicator lights showing active channels and emergency frequencies. But the staff who should have been coordinating emergency response were standing silently around the consoles, occasionally reaching toward controls without actually manipulating them. I realized that if I could reach that communication center, I might be able to contact emergency services and report what I was seeing. The infected staff didn't seem to be actively hostile unless they encountered living people, and they might not perceive me as a threat if I moved carefully and avoided direct confrontation. The ventilation shaft had access points throughout the hospital complex, including one that opened directly into the communication center. But reaching it would require crawling past several areas where infected individuals were gathered, and any noise I made could attract their attention. I decided to try, because the information I'd gathered about the contamination source could be crucial for emergency responders. If they understood that the outbreak had originated with contaminated medical linens, they might be able to trace the distribution network and identify other facilities at risk. Moving as quietly as possible through the ventilation system, I made my way toward the communication center. The shaft passed directly over several compromised areas, and I could see infected hospital staff below me through the grills. Doctors, nurses, orderlies, security guards, all of them exhibiting the same symptoms I'd observed in Jimmy Martinez and the others who tried to break into my facility. But I also noticed something else. The infected individuals weren't randomly distributed throughout the hospital. They were concentrated in areas related to their former job functions. Nurses gathered around nursing stations. Doctors clustered in examination rooms. Laboratory technicians stood motionless in lab spaces. It was like they were trying to continue their normal routines, but had lost the cognitive ability to actually perform their duties. They remembered where they belonged in the hospital hierarchy and facility layout, but they'd forgotten how to function as medical professionals. This pattern suggested that whatever contamination had affected them preserved certain types of memory while destroying others. They retained spatial awareness and procedural memory related to their work environments, but they'd lost higher cognitive functions like communication, problem-solving, and social interaction. I reached the access point above the communication center and carefully removed the ventilation grill. The room below contained sophisticated radio equipment for coordinating with emergency services, other hospitals, and medical transport units. Multiple frequencies were active, with status lights indicating ongoing transmissions throughout the metro area. But the three staff members who should have been operating the communication systems were standing motionless around the central console. They would occasionally reach toward controls or pick up radio handsets, but they never actually attempted to communicate. Like they remembered the physical motions of their jobs without understanding the purpose behind them. I lowered myself carefully into the communication center, landing as quietly as possible on the floor behind the main console bank. The infected staff members didn't react to my presence initially, continuing their purposeless mimicry of normal communication procedures. The radio equipment showed multiple emergency channels with active traffic. I could hear fragments of reports from throughout the Detroit metropolitan area, and what I was hearing confirmed my worst fears about the scope of the crisis. Multiple hospitals were reporting similar incidents, staff members becoming unresponsive or exhibiting unusual behavior, communication blackouts from entire medical facilities, emergency services overwhelmed with calls about violent incidents at healthcare locations throughout the region. But most concerning were reports from facilities that shared supply chains with Detroit General, hospitals that used the same laundry services, medical supply distributors, or equipment maintenance contracts. The contamination wasn't limited to a single location or incident. It was spreading through the interconnected network of services that supported the entire regional healthcare system. I grabbed a radio handset and tried to contact emergency dispatch on the primary emergency frequency. The connection went through, but the dispatcher sounded overwhelmed and stressed. Emergency services, state your location and nature of emergency. This is Vernon Kowalski at Metro Hospital Services. I have critical information about the contamination source affecting Detroit General Hospital and potentially other medical facilities in the region. Sir, we're receiving multiple reports of incidents at healthcare facilities throughout the metro area. Emergency response teams are coordinating with federal authorities, but we have limited information about the nature of the threat. The contamination is spreading through medical linens and potentially other supplies. I've been processing infected materials all night, and I'm currently inside Detroit General Hospital. The entire facility is compromised, but the staff aren't dead. They're infected with something that preserves basic motor functions while destroying higher cognitive abilities. The line was quiet for several seconds before the dispatcher responded. Sir, can you confirm your current location and safety status? We're receiving reports that Detroit General Hospital has been evacuated and is under quarantine. Negative on the evacuation. There are infected staff members throughout the facility, but they're not behaving aggressively unless directly confronted. They seem to be trying to continue normal operations without understanding what they're doing or why. Before the dispatcher could respond, one of the infected communication staff members turned toward me. His eyes were the same milky white I'd seen in all the others, but his expression was different, more focused, like he was beginning to register my presence as something unusual. I backed away from the radio console, but the infected staff member began moving toward me with more purpose than the aimless wandering I'd observed earlier. The other two infected individuals in the room also turned in my direction, as if my voice or movement had triggered some kind of recognition response. Sir, are you still there? The dispatcher's voice crackled through the radio handset I was still holding. I have to go, I whispered into the microphone. The infected staff are becoming aware of my presence. If emergency teams are planning to enter Detroit General, they need to understand that these people aren't dead and they're not completely mindless. They retain enough cognitive function to be dangerous. I set down the handset and moved toward the ventilation access point, but the infected staff members were blocking my path. They moved with more coordination than I'd expected, positioning themselves to prevent my escape while maintaining enough distance to avoid the chemical spray bottles I was carrying. That coordination was terrifying. It meant they retained enough intelligence to assess threats and develop basic tactical responses. They weren't shambling zombies from horror movies. They were infected humans who remembered enough about problem-solving to be effective predators. I pulled out one of the disinfectant spray bottles and aimed it toward the closest infected staff member. The industrial chemical would cause severe tissue damage on contact, potentially incapacitating anyone who was still vulnerable to physical harm. But before I could deploy the chemical weapon, something unexpected happened. The infected staff member I was targeting held up his hand in what looked like a defensive gesture. Not the mindless advance of a creature driven by instinct, but a conscious attempt to avoid danger. "Don't," he said, and his voice was almost normal except for the flat, emotionless tone. Not necessary. Information. Important. The fact that he could speak coherently, that he understood the threat I represented and was trying to negotiate rather than attack, completely changed my understanding of what I was dealing with. These weren't mindless, infected individuals. They were people who had retained significant cognitive abilities while losing something essential about their humanity. "What do you want?" I asked, keeping the spray bottle aimed at him while looking for alternate escape routes. "Hospital operations. Continue. Normal. You understand systems, procedures. Help maintain." His speech was stilted and missing normal inflection, but the content was sophisticated. He wanted me to help them continue running the hospital, using my knowledge of industrial systems and contamination procedures to support their operations. The implication was staggering. They weren't trying to spread infection or harm people. They were trying to preserve the healthcare system they'd been part of before becoming infected. But they'd lost the cognitive abilities necessary to actually provide medical care, so they needed uninfected individuals to help them maintain basic operations. The hospital isn't functioning, I told him. Patients aren't being treated. Medical procedures aren't being performed correctly. People are dying because infected staff can't provide proper care. Learning, he responded. Adapting. Systems complex. Need time. Need help. You teach. We learn. The conversation was becoming surreal. I was negotiating with an infected hospital staff member who was trying to recruit me to help train other infected individuals to resume their medical duties. It was like they understood that they'd lost important capabilities, but believed they could reacquire them through instruction and practice. But what they'd lost wasn't just knowledge or skill. They'd lost empathy, judgment, and the complex emotional responses that made effective medical care possible. You couldn't teach someone to care about patient welfare or make ethical decisions under pressure. Those qualities were fundamentally human, and whatever had infected these people had stripped away their humanity while leaving their intelligence largely intact. I can't help you, I said. What you're asking isn't possible. The people you're trying to treat need real medical care from uninfected professionals. Uninfected professionals becoming infected, he replied matter-of-factly. Soon all medical staff will be enhanced, then continuity maintained, systems preserved, enhanced. That's how he saw the infection, not as a disease or contamination, but as an improvement or upgrade that would allow medical professionals to function more effectively. The arrogance was chilling, especially coming from someone who'd lost the basic human qualities that made healthcare a caring profession rather than just technical procedure. I realized that trying to reason with them was pointless. Whatever had infected them had preserved their intelligence and technical knowledge, while eliminating their ability to understand the emotional and ethical dimensions of medical care. They genuinely believed they were trying to help people, but they'd lost the capacity to recognize that their help was actually harmful. I need to leave, I told them. Other people need to know what's happening here. Cannot permit, the infected staff member replied. Information restricted, security protocols, hospital confidentiality. They were using medical privacy regulations to justify preventing me from reporting what I'd witnessed. The infected staff retained enough understanding of hospital procedures to invoke patient confidentiality rules, but they'd lost the judgment to recognize when those rules shouldn't apply. I aimed the disinfectant spray bottle more directly at the closest infected individual. I'm leaving. Don't try to stop me. Chemical exposure dangerous, he said, still in that flat, emotionless tone. Safety protocols require containment, protective equipment, proper procedures. Even while being threatened with chemical weapons, he was reciting safety regulations. The infection had preserved their procedural knowledge while destroying their ability to apply that knowledge appropriately to actual situations. I backed toward the ventilation access point, keeping the spray bottle aimed at the infected staff members. They maintained their distance but followed my movement, clearly intending to prevent my escape without directly confronting the chemical threat I represented. Enhanced individuals require uninfected assistance temporarily, the spokesman continued. Cooperation beneficial. Resistance creates complications. The clinical language he used to describe what was essentially kidnapping and forced collaboration made the conversation even more disturbing. He was proposing that I voluntarily join their effort to maintain hospital operations, using infected staff who couldn't actually provide competent medical care. I reached the ventilation access point and began climbing back into the shaft system. The infected staff members moved closer but didn't try to physically stop me. Instead, they continued their attempts at persuasion. Facility connections extensive, the spokesman said as I pulled myself into the ventilation shaft. All hospitals linked. All staff will be enhanced. Cooperation now prevents complications later. His words followed me as I moved through the shaft system, and the implications were terrifying. If the infection was spreading through the interconnected network of medical facilities, and if infected staff retained enough intelligence to coordinate their activities, then the entire regional healthcare system could be compromised within hours. I needed to reach emergency responders and warn them that this wasn't a typical disease outbreak. The infected individuals weren't mindless threats that could be contained through standard quarantine procedures. They were intelligent adversaries who understood hospital operations and were actively working to expand their influence throughout the medical system. But as I crawled through the ventilation shafts toward what I hoped would be a safe exit point, I could hear sounds that suggested the infection was spreading faster than I'd realized. Multiple voices throughout the hospital complex, all speaking in the same flat, emotionless tone I'd heard from the communication center staff. They were coordinating their activities, sharing information about hospital operations, and developing strategies for maintaining medical services using infected personnel. It was like listening to the emergence of a new form of collective intelligence that preserved technical knowledge while eliminating human compassion. And somewhere in their clinical discussions, I heard references to expansion protocols and integration procedures. They weren't just trying to maintain existing hospital operations. They were planning to spread the infection to other medical facilities throughout the region. I had to get out of the hospital complex and warn emergency responders before the infected staff could implement whatever expansion plans they were developing. But as I moved through the ventilation system, I realized that escape might be more difficult than I'd anticipated. The infected staff knew I was in the ventilation shafts, and they were coordinating efforts to intercept me at potential exit points. I could hear them discussing facility layouts and access routes with the same systematic thoroughness they'd once applied to patient care. I was trapped in a hospital full of intelligent, infected individuals who saw me as either a potential recruit or a security threat that needed to be contained. And time was running out before they implemented plans that could spread the infection throughout the entire regional healthcare system. Moving through the ventilation system with infected hospital staff coordinating below me, I realized my chemical weapons were more than just defensive tools. These industrial disinfectants represented 18 years of knowledge about eliminating biological threats, and if I was right about the nature of this infection, they might be the key to stopping its spread. I had concentrated bleach solutions that could neutralize organic contamination, ammonia compounds that created hostile environments for biological agents, and hydrogen peroxide mixtures that hospitals used for the most aggressive sterilization procedures. The infected staff members had avoided direct contact with these chemicals, suggesting they retained enough survival instinct to recognize genuine threats. But more importantly, I understood how these chemicals could be deployed on an industrial scale. The hospital's own cleaning systems, the ventilation networks, the water treatment facilities. Every major medical complex had infrastructure designed to distribute disinfectants throughout the building for contamination control. If I could access those systems, I might be able to create an environment hostile enough to stop the infection from spreading further. The ventilation shaft I was crawling through connected to the hospital's main air handling system, which included chemical injection ports for emergency decontamination procedures. During major contamination events, industrial disinfectants could be introduced directly into the air circulation system to neutralize biological threats throughout the entire facility. I'd never operated these systems personally, but I'd worked with similar equipment at my laundry facility for years. The principles were the same: controlled chemical distribution through existing infrastructure to achieve comprehensive sterilization. The main difference was scale and complexity. As I moved toward the air handling equipment, I could hear the infected staff members below discussing search patterns and containment procedures. They were systematically checking every possible exit route from the hospital complex, working with the kind of methodical thoroughness they'd once applied to patient care. Ventilation access points monitored. One voice reported through the facility's intercom system. Subject contained within hospital complex. Expansion protocols can proceed on schedule. Expansion protocols. They weren't just trying to maintain operations at Detroit General. They were planning to spread the infection to other medical facilities throughout the region, using the same supply networks and service connection that had brought the contamination to my laundry facility in the first place. I reached the main air handling chamber, a large mechanical room filled with massive fans, filtration systems, and chemical injection equipment. The space was dimly lit by emergency lighting, but I could see well enough to identify the systems I needed to access. The chemical injection ports were designed to introduce disinfectants into the main air supply during emergency decontamination procedures. Hospital maintenance staff could activate these systems remotely in case of biological weapon attacks, infectious disease outbreaks, or major contamination incidents. But the systems had been designed with safety interlocks to prevent accidental exposure of hospital staff to dangerous chemical concentrations. Those same safety measures would prevent me from deploying chemicals at levels that might actually affect the infected individuals, unless I could bypass the safety systems manually. I began examining the chemical injection equipment, looking for manual override controls that would allow me to introduce much higher concentrations of disinfectants than normal safety protocols permitted. The infected staff might have retained their intelligence and procedural knowledge, but industrial chemical exposure at sufficient concentrations could damage the biological systems that supported their cognitive functions. As I worked on the air handling systems, I heard footsteps approaching the mechanical room. The infected staff had tracked my location through the ventilation network and were moving to intercept me before I could implement whatever plans they suspected I was developing. I quickly filled the chemical injection reservoir with concentrated bleach solution, then began bypassing safety interlocks that would normally prevent dangerous chemical releases. The work required technical knowledge I'd developed over years of maintaining industrial cleaning equipment, but the basic principles were similar to systems I'd operated hundreds of times. The footsteps were getting closer, and I could hear voices discussing containment procedures and security protocols. They knew exactly what I was trying to do, and they understood the threat it represented to their continued operations. Chemical contamination protocols require immediate evacuation, one voice called through the door. Safety procedures mandate cessation of unauthorized activities. Even while trying to stop me from deploying chemical weapons against them, they were reciting proper safety regulations. The infection had preserved their procedural knowledge so completely that they couldn't help following established protocols, even when those protocols worked against their own interests. I completed the safety bypass procedures and activated the chemical injection system. Industrial-strength bleach solution began flowing into the main air circulation network, carried throughout the hospital complex by the ventilation fans. Within minutes, every room and corridor in the facility would be filled with chemical concentrations far above normal safety limits. The infected staff members outside the mechanical room began coughing almost immediately as the chemical vapors reached them through the ventilation system. But instead of retreating to avoid exposure, they started trying to force open the door to the mechanical room. Contamination containment required, one of them said between coughing fits. Source elimination necessary. Medical emergency protocols. They were willing to expose themselves to dangerous chemical concentrations in order to stop me from contaminating their facility. It was like they understood that the chemical treatment threatened their ability to function as a collective, but they couldn't override their programmed responses to perceived medical emergencies. I activated additional chemical injection systems, introducing ammonia compounds and hydrogen peroxide into different sections of the air circulation network. The combination would create an atmosphere hostile to most forms of biological contamination, including whatever agent had infected the hospital staff. The door to the mechanical room finally gave way under sustained assault, and 3 infected staff members entered the chamber. But they were clearly affected by the chemical exposure, moving more slowly and having difficulty coordinating their actions. "Cease contamination procedures," one of them said, but his voice was weaker and less authoritative than before. "Safety violations, patient endangerment, regulatory compliance required." I backed away from the chemical injection controls, but the systems were already operating automatically. The bleach, ammonia, and hydrogen peroxide were circulating throughout the hospital complex, creating an environment that should neutralize most biological threats. But the infected staff members weren't collapsing or becoming incapacitated as I'd expected. They were clearly affected by the chemical exposure, but they retained enough cognitive function to continue their efforts to stop the contamination procedures. "Enhanced biological systems resistant to standard chemical treatments," one of them explained, apparently reading my confusion. "Adaptation protocols include environmental hazard resistance. Countermeasures required." They were telling me that whatever had infected them included resistance to the very chemicals I was using to try to stop them. The infection had been designed or had evolved to survive in hospital environments where aggressive chemical disinfection was routinely used. But I could see that the chemical exposure was having some effect. Their movements were becoming less coordinated, their speech patterns were deteriorating, and they seemed to be having difficulty maintaining the collective awareness that had made them so effective at coordinating their activities. I needed to increase the chemical concentrations beyond what the hospital systems could deliver safely. The industrial equipment at my laundry facility was designed to handle much higher concentrations of dangerous chemicals, and I had portable containers of concentrated disinfectants that could be deployed directly rather than through diluted injection systems. "Enhanced systems require maintenance support," one of the infected staff members said as I prepared to leave the mechanical room. "Cooperation eliminates need for hostile chemical environment. Mutual benefit achieved through collaboration." They were still trying to recruit me, even while being exposed to chemical concentrations that would incapacitate normal humans. But their offer confirmed something important. They needed uninfected individuals to help maintain the complex systems that supported their operations. If they were dependent on technical support from people like me, then sabotaging those systems might be more effective than direct chemical attacks. Hospitals required constant maintenance of mechanical systems, computer networks, and supply chains. Without uninfected technicians to provide that support, even highly intelligent infected staff would eventually face operational failures they couldn't resolve independently. I left the mechanical room through a maintenance corridor that connected to the service tunnel network. The chemical vapors I'd introduced into the air circulation system were spreading throughout the hospital complex, and I could hear infected staff members throughout the facility responding to the contamination. But instead of evacuating or seeking medical treatment, they were implementing containment procedures and discussing adaptation strategies. They understood that the chemical exposure represented a threat to their collective operations, and they were working together to minimize its impact while developing countermeasures. Moving through the service tunnels, I could access other medical facilities in the complex without exposure to the chemical contamination I'd created. But I could also hear evidence that the infection was spreading beyond Detroit General Hospital. Radio communications from other hospitals in the region were reporting similar incidents. Staff members exhibiting unusual behavior, communication blackouts, and requests for emergency assistance that cut off mid-transmission. The infection was following the same supply networks and service connections that linked all the major medical facilities in the metro area. I reached a junction in the service tunnel system where maintenance corridors from 3 different hospitals converged. Through ventilation grills, I could see into facilities that should have been operating normally, but showed the same signs of compromise I'd witnessed at Detroit General. Emergency departments with infected staff members wandering aimlessly through treatment areas. Operating rooms abandoned mid-procedure. Patient areas showing evidence of violent struggles, but also signs of organized activity, with infected individuals gathering in specific locations and coordinating their efforts to maintain basic hospital functions. The pattern was repeating across multiple facilities, which meant the infection had been spreading through the regional healthcare system for hours before I'd encountered the first symptoms at my laundry facility. The contaminated linens I'd been processing were just one vector in a much larger distribution network. But I also noticed something that gave me hope. The infected staff at different hospitals weren't coordinating with each other effectively. Each facility was operating independently, trying to maintain its own operations without broader strategic planning. They had retained intelligence and procedural knowledge, but they'd lost the ability to form complex organizational structures that extended beyond their immediate work environments. If I could disrupt the service networks that connected these facilities, I might be able to prevent them from eventually developing coordinated responses to containment efforts. The same infrastructure that had allowed the infection to spread could be used to isolate infected facilities and limit their ability to expand their operations. I made my way through the service tunnels toward the central utility complex that provided power, water, and communication services to the entire medical district. If I could access the master control systems, I might be able to implement isolation protocols that would cut off infected facilities from external resources and communication networks. As I moved through the tunnels, I encountered someone else who wasn't infected. A woman in surgical scrubs was hiding in a maintenance alcove, clearly trying to avoid detection by infected hospital staff. When she saw me, her initial reaction was fear, but she quickly realized I wasn't exhibiting the symptoms she'd learned to associate with the infection. "Are you from outside the hospital?" she whispered. "I'm Dr. Sarah Kim from the Infectious Disease Unit. I've been hiding in these tunnels for hours trying to understand what's happening to my colleagues." I explained my background as a laundry worker and described what I'd learned about the infection spread through contaminated medical supplies. Dr. Kim's medical knowledge, combined with my understanding of industrial systems and facility operations, could provide insights that neither of us could develop independently. The infection preserves cognitive abilities while eliminating emotional responses and ethical reasoning, she explained. They retain technical knowledge and procedural memory, but they've lost the capacity for empathy and moral judgment that makes effective medical care possible. Her clinical analysis confirmed what I'd observed during my encounters with infected staff members. They genuinely believed they were trying to help people, but they'd lost the human qualities that distinguished caring medical treatment from purely technical procedures. "They're planning to expand their operations to other medical facilities," I told her. "They see the infection as an enhancement that will allow them to provide more efficient healthcare services." Dr. Kim's expression became grim. If they succeed in spreading the infection throughout the regional healthcare system, they could maintain the appearance of normal medical operations while actually providing care that lacks any genuine concern for patient welfare. People would die from technically correct procedures applied without appropriate judgment or compassion. We needed to warn emergency responders about the true nature of the threat and provide them with information about how to contain the infection spread. But we also needed to understand the full scope of the contamination network before infected facilities could implement their expansion protocols. Dr. Kim had been monitoring radio communications from her hiding place in the service tunnels, and she'd gathered information about the infection's progression throughout the metro area. Multiple hospitals were reporting incidents, but emergency responders didn't understand that they were dealing with intelligent adversaries rather than typical disease outbreak scenarios. The infected staff are using medical privacy regulations to limit information sharing with external authorities, she explained. They invoke patient confidentiality rules to justify preventing emergency responders from accessing contaminated facilities. That explained why emergency services seemed to have limited information about what was actually happening inside the affected hospitals. The infected staff were using their retained knowledge of medical regulations to create barriers that prevented effective outside intervention. We made our way through the service tunnel system toward the central utility complex, sharing information about what we'd observed and developing strategies for disrupting the infection's expansion efforts. Dr. Kim's radio allowed us to monitor emergency communications and coordinate with any outside responders who might be willing to take unconventional action based on our intelligence. But as we moved through the tunnels, we encountered evidence that the infection was adapting to containment efforts more quickly than we'd expected. The chemical contamination I'd introduced into Detroit General's air circulation system had forced the infected staff to implement countermeasures, but it hadn't incapacitated them as effectively as I'd hoped. Instead, they were developing procedures for operating in chemically hostile environments, using protective equipment and modified protocols to maintain their activities despite the contamination. They were learning from the threats they encountered and adapting their operations to overcome new challenges. They're evolving, Dr. Kim observed as we listened to infected staff communications through ventilation grills. Not biologically, but behaviorally. They're developing new procedures and strategies based on the obstacles they encounter. That adaptability made them far more dangerous than simple biological threats. Traditional containment procedures were designed to deal with pathogens that followed predictable patterns of spread and infection. But these infected individuals could analyze containment efforts and develop countermeasures that allowed them to maintain operations despite external pressure. We reached the central utility complex and began examining the control systems that provided essential services to the entire medical district. Power distribution, water treatment, telecommunications, and emergency communication networks all passed through centralized facilities that could be accessed and controlled by maintenance personnel with appropriate technical knowledge. If we can isolate the infected facilities from external resources, we might be able to limit their ability to coordinate expansion efforts, I explained to Dr. Kim. They need power, water, and communication systems to maintain hospital operations. Without those resources, even intelligent infected staff would face operational challenges they couldn't overcome independently. But implementing isolation protocols would also cut off any uninfected survivors who might still be hiding in the compromised facilities. We'd be sacrificing people who might be saved in order to prevent the infection from spreading to additional hospitals throughout the region. Dr. Kim understood the ethical implications of what I was proposing. We need to establish communication with emergency responders and coordinate evacuation efforts for any remaining uninfected individuals before implementing isolation procedures. Her radio picked up emergency frequencies, and we began trying to contact authorities who might be coordinating containment efforts. But the communications we intercepted suggested that emergency responders were struggling to understand the nature of the threat they were facing. Reports from infected facilities were inconsistent and often contradictory. Some described violent incidents and medical emergencies. Others reported normal operations with minor staffing issues. The infected staff were providing information that minimized the apparent severity of the situation while creating bureaucratic obstacles to external intervention. Emergency services don't understand that they're receiving reports from infected individuals who retain enough intelligence to manipulate information flow, Dr. Kim observed. They think they're dealing with isolated incidents at individual hospitals rather than a coordinated effort to expand contamination throughout the healthcare system. We needed to provide emergency responders with accurate intelligence about the infection's nature and scope before infected facilities could implement expansion protocols that would spread the contamination beyond the current medical district. But we also needed to ensure that any intervention efforts took into account the intelligence and adaptability of the infected staff. Time was running out before the infected facilities would begin coordinating their activities and implementing plans that could spread the infection throughout the entire regional healthcare network. And somewhere in the central utility complex, we might be able to access the master control systems that could prevent that expansion from succeeding. But first, we needed to warn the outside world about what was really happening in Detroit's medical district. The infected staff were planning something far more dangerous than anyone realized, and traditional emergency response procedures wouldn't be adequate to contain a threat that could think, plan, and adapt to countermeasures. Dr. Kim and I reached the central utility complex and found the master control systems that managed power, water, and communications for the entire medical district. But as we began examining the control panels, we realized the scope of what we were facing was far larger than either of us had understood. The infected facilities weren't just trying to maintain local operations. They were coordinating with contaminated sites throughout the entire metro area. Through the utility monitoring systems, we could see power consumption patterns from dozens of medical facilities across Detroit. Hospitals that should have been operating normally were showing the irregular electrical usage that indicated infected staff attempting to maintain operations without proper coordination. Emergency lighting systems running continuously, medical equipment operating outside normal parameters, and communication systems transmitting constantly as infected staff tried to coordinate their activities. They're trying to network all the contaminated facilities, Dr. Kim observed as she monitored the communication traffic, creating a regional coordination system that would allow them to share resources and coordinate expansion efforts. The infected staff had retained enough technical knowledge to understand that isolated facilities would eventually face operational challenges they couldn't overcome independently. But if they could establish communication and resource sharing between contaminated sites, they could create a distributed healthcare system that would be much more difficult to contain or eliminate. I began accessing the utility control systems, looking for ways to disrupt the communication networks that the infected facilities were using to coordinate their activities. But the master controls were protected by security protocols that required authorization codes I didn't have access to. That's when Dr. Kim's radio picked up a transmission that changed everything. Military frequencies were becoming active, with references to quarantine zones and air support operations. Federal authorities had apparently recognized the severity of the situation and were implementing containment procedures that went far beyond normal emergency response protocols. Quarantine perimeter established around Detroit Medical District, the transmission reported. No unauthorized personnel permitted inside containment zone. Air support standing by for sterilization operations. Sterilization operations. They were planning to destroy the entire medical district to prevent the infection from spreading further. Every hospital, clinic, and medical facility in the region would be eliminated along with anyone still inside the quarantine zone. "We need to get out of here immediately," Dr. Kim said. "If military forces are implementing sterilization procedures, we have maybe an hour before they begin bombing operations." But I realized that my knowledge of the facility infrastructure could be crucial for evacuation efforts. I was the only person outside the infected staff who understood the service tunnel networks, utility systems, and delivery routes that connected all the medical facilities in the district. Without that information, Any survivors hiding in the contaminated facilities would be trapped when the sterilization operations began. I used the utility communication systems to contact the military frequencies that Dr. Kim had been monitoring. The connection went through, but the response was immediate and authoritative. "This is Colonel Martinez, Biological Containment Unit. Identify yourself and state your location." "This is Vernon Kowalski, Metro Hospital Services. I'm currently in the Central Utility Complex with Dr. Sarah Kim from Detroit General's Infectious Disease Unit. We have critical intelligence about the nature of the contamination and the location of potential survivors." "Mr. Kowalski, all personnel inside the quarantine zone are considered potentially infected. Evacuation protocols are not feasible given the nature of the biological threat." "Colonel, the infected individuals retain full intelligence and are coordinating their activities across multiple facilities. They're not mindless infected. They're intelligent adversaries who are planning to expand the contamination throughout the regional healthcare system." The line was quiet for several seconds before Colonel Martinez responded. "Explain the nature of the intelligence threat." I described what Dr. Kim and I had observed about the infected staff's retained cognitive abilities, their coordination efforts, and their plans for expanding operations to uncontaminated medical facilities. The military needed to understand that standard biological containment procedures wouldn't be effective against adversaries who could analyze military tactics and develop countermeasures. The infected staff are using medical privacy regulations to limit information sharing with outside authorities, Dr. Kim added. They're creating bureaucratic obstacles to intervention while implementing expansion protocols that could spread the contamination beyond the current containment zone. Colonel Martinez's response indicated that military intelligence had been struggling to understand the inconsistent reports they were receiving from inside the contaminated facilities. Our information explained why infected staff were providing misleading reports while maintaining the appearance of normal medical operations. "Mr. Kowalski, your knowledge of facility infrastructure could be valuable for extraction operations. Can you provide detailed information about service tunnel networks and potential evacuation routes for any remaining uninfected personnel?" I began describing the underground service networks that connected all the medical facilities in the district. But as I provided the information, I realized that the same routes could be used by infected staff to escape the containment zone before sterilization operations began. "Colonel, the service tunnels extend beyond the current quarantine perimeter. If infected staff understand that sterilization operations are planned, they could use these routes to evacuate to uncontaminated facilities outside the containment zone." The implications were staggering. Military containment procedures were based on the assumption that biological threats couldn't develop tactical responses to military operations. But intelligent infected individuals could monitor military communications, analyze containment strategies, and implement escape plans that would allow them to spread the infection beyond any quarantine zone. "We need immediate intelligence about infected staff movements and capabilities," Colonel Martinez said. "Can you continue monitoring their activities and report any indication that they're preparing to evacuate the containment zone?" Dr. Kim and I began using the utility monitoring systems to track activities throughout the medical district. Power consumption patterns showed increased activity at facilities near the edges of the quarantine zone, suggesting that infected staff were indeed preparing to move operations to locations outside the containment area. "They're consolidating resources at facilities with the best access to external transportation networks," I reported. "It looks like they're preparing to evacuate essential personnel and equipment before sterilization operations begin." But we also discovered something even more concerning. The infected staff were accessing pharmaceutical storage areas and laboratory facilities, gathering medical supplies and research materials that could be used to reproduce the infection at new locations. Colonel, they're collecting biological samples and pharmaceutical supplies that could allow them to replicate the infection process at uncontaminated facilities. Even if sterilization operations are successful, they could recreate the contamination elsewhere. The military response was immediate and decisive. Sterilization timeline accelerated. All personnel inside quarantine zone have 30 minutes to reach designated evacuation points before air support operations commence. 30 minutes. Dr. Kim and I were deep inside the central utility complex, with no direct access to the evacuation points that military forces had established outside the quarantine perimeter. But I knew the service tunnel networks well enough to find routes that might get us to safety before the bombing began. There's a maintenance tunnel that connects to the water treatment facility outside the medical district, I told Dr. Kim. If we can reach that facility before the sterilization operations begin, we might be able to get outside the quarantine zone. But as we prepared to leave the utility complex, I realized that shutting down the master control systems could disrupt the infected staff's evacuation efforts and prevent them from escaping with the biological materials they'd collected. If I shut down power and communications to the entire medical district, the infected staff won't be able to coordinate their evacuation efforts or access the electronic systems they need to transport biological samples safely. Dr. Kim understood the implications, but shutting down the utilities will also eliminate any chance for uninfected survivors to reach evacuation points before the bombing begins. I was faced with a choice that would determine whether the infection could spread beyond the current containment zone, save potential survivors inside the quarantine area, or prevent infected staff from escaping with the materials they needed to recreate the contamination elsewhere. The infected staff are the greater threat, Dr. Kim said. They have the intelligence and resources to spread the infection throughout the entire healthcare system. Individual survivors, while important, can't cause the same level of regional catastrophe. I began implementing shutdown procedures for the master utility systems, power distribution networks, water treatment facilities, and communication systems throughout the medical district began going offline as I activated emergency isolation protocols. Through the monitoring systems, I could see the immediate impact on infected staff activities. Facilities that had been showing coordinated movements suddenly went dark. Communication networks that had been carrying constant traffic fell silent. The infected staff's evacuation efforts were being disrupted by the loss of essential infrastructure. But the shutdown procedures also eliminated lighting, ventilation, and communication systems that any remaining uninfected survivors would need to reach evacuation points safely. I was potentially sacrificing people who could be saved in order to prevent a much larger catastrophe. Military forces will understand why we implemented the shutdown, Dr. Kim said as we prepared to evacuate the utility complex. The strategic value of preventing infected staff from escaping with biological materials outweighs the risk to individual survivors. We made our way through the service tunnels toward the water treatment facility, but the utility shutdown had eliminated most of the lighting and ventilation systems that made the underground networks navigable. Emergency lighting provided minimal illumination, and the air was becoming stale without mechanical circulation. Behind us, we could hear sounds of movement throughout the service tunnel networks. The infected staff were attempting to evacuate despite the utility failures, but their coordination efforts had been severely disrupted by the loss of communication systems. As we moved through the tunnels, Dr. Kim's radio picked up military communications, indicating that sterilization operations were proceeding on schedule. Air support units were moving into position, and ground forces were securing the quarantine perimeter to prevent any escape attempts. Biological containment successful, Colonel Martinez's voice reported. No movement detected outside quarantine zone. Sterilization operations commencing in 15 minutes. We reached the water treatment facility just as the first military aircraft appeared overhead. The facility was outside the quarantine perimeter, but close enough that we could see the medical district being evacuated of any remaining military personnel before the bombing began. Dr. Kim established contact with military forces and provided them with detailed intelligence about what we'd observed inside the contaminated facilities. The information would be crucial for preventing similar outbreaks and developing countermeasures against intelligent biological threats. But as we watched the sterilization operations begin, I realized that the infection had taught us something important about the vulnerabilities in our healthcare system. The interconnected networks of supplies, services, and personnel that made modern medical care possible could also be used to spread contamination rapidly throughout entire regions. The infected staff at Detroit General had been trying to create a new form of healthcare system that preserved technical competence while eliminating the human qualities that made medical care truly beneficial. Their failure wasn't just a victory against biological contamination. It was a reminder that technology and knowledge without compassion and ethical judgment could be more dangerous than ignorance. The bombing continued for hours, eliminating every structure in the medical district and ensuring that no biological materials could survive to recreate the infection elsewhere. When it was over, the entire regional healthcare system would need to be rebuilt from scratch, but it would be rebuilt by people who understood the importance of maintaining humanity along with technical competence. Military forces established decontamination procedures for anyone who had been inside the quarantine zone, but Dr. Kim and I were eventually cleared for release after extensive medical examinations confirmed that we hadn't been infected. The sterilization operations destroyed every building in Detroit's medical district, but the real work was just beginning. Colonel Martinez debriefed Dr. Kim and me extensively, and what we learned during those sessions changed everything I thought I knew about the outbreak we'd survived. The infection hadn't started at Detroit General Hospital. It had originated at a pharmaceutical research facility in Ohio 3 weeks earlier, where researchers were developing enhanced cognitive enhancement treatments for medical professionals. The goal was to create medications that would allow doctors and nurses to process information more quickly and make decisions with greater precision during emergency situations. But something had gone wrong with the experimental treatments. Instead of enhancing cognitive abilities while preserving normal human emotional responses, the medications had created a condition that preserved intelligence and technical knowledge while eliminating empathy, moral reasoning, and the capacity for genuine human connection. The infected researchers had continued their work, believing they were developing breakthrough treatments that would revolutionize healthcare. They distributed their experimental medications to medical facilities throughout the Midwest, marketing them as revolutionary cognitive enhancement supplements for healthcare professionals. Detroit General had been one of the first hospitals to participate in the clinical trials. The medications had been distributed through the normal pharmaceutical supply chain, reaching doctors, nurses, and other medical staff who had volunteered to test the cognitive enhancement treatments. But the infected staff at the research facility had retained enough intelligence to understand that their condition represented an improvement rather than a disease. They deliberately concealed the true effects of the medications while expanding the distribution network to include as many medical facilities as possible. The contaminated linens you processed were just one vector in a much larger distribution strategy, Colonel Martinez explained. The infected staff were using multiple supply chains to spread the condition throughout the regional healthcare system. Dr. Kim's medical expertise helped military researchers understand the biological mechanisms behind the infection. The experimental medications had targeted specific neural pathways associated with emotional processing and ethical reasoning, while leaving cognitive functions and procedural memory completely intact. It's not technically a disease in the traditional sense, she explained. It's a pharmacologically induced modification of brain chemistry that preserves intellectual abilities while eliminating the emotional responses that make human compassion possible. The implications were staggering. If the infected researchers had succeeded in distributing their medications throughout the entire healthcare system, they could have created a generation of medical professionals who possessed all the technical knowledge necessary to provide medical care, but lacked the human qualities that made that care genuinely beneficial. Military intelligence was coordinating with federal health authorities to trace the distribution network and identify other medical facilities that might have been exposed to the experimental medications. The operation was revealing the scope of a conspiracy that extended far beyond the Detroit Medical District. "We've identified contaminated facilities in 6 states," Colonel Martinez told us, "each one following the same pattern you observed at Detroit General. Intelligent, infected staff attempting to maintain normal medical operations while planning expansion to uncontaminated facilities." But the infected researchers had made a critical mistake in their distribution strategy. They'd been too successful in preserving the intelligence and procedural knowledge of infected individuals. The contaminated staff retained enough cognitive ability to understand that their condition was artificial and could potentially be reversed. Some infected medical professionals were beginning to recognize that they'd lost essential human qualities and were seeking ways to restore their normal emotional responses. These individuals were providing crucial intelligence about the distribution network and helping authorities identify facilities that had been exposed to the experimental medications. "The infection isn't permanent," Dr. Kim explained. "The neural modifications can be reversed through specific pharmaceutical interventions, but only if treatment is administered within a limited time frame after initial exposure." Military forces were implementing containment and treatment protocols at contaminated facilities throughout the region, but the process required cooperation from infected staff who retained enough self-awareness to recognize that they needed help. My knowledge of industrial systems and supply chain networks became crucial for the containment efforts. The same infrastructure that had allowed the infection to spread could be used to distribute treatment medications and coordinate recovery operations. Your understanding of how medical facilities share resources and services is helping us identify potential contamination pathways we might have missed," Colonel Martinez said. "We need people with your technical background to help design distribution systems for the treatment medications." I found myself working with military logistics specialists and medical researchers to develop protocols for safely distributing pharmaceutical treatments to contaminated facilities. The work required understanding both the industrial systems that supported healthcare operations and the psychological challenges of treating people who might not recognize that they needed help. But we also discovered that the infection had taught us valuable lessons about the vulnerabilities in our healthcare system. The interconnected networks of supplies, services, and personnel that made modern medical care possible had also made it possible for a small group of infected researchers to contaminate facilities throughout multiple states within a matter of weeks. We need to implement safeguards that prevent this kind of coordinated contamination from happening again, Dr. Kim observed. The same efficiency that makes our healthcare system effective also makes it vulnerable to systematic compromise. Federal health authorities were developing new protocols for testing and monitoring pharmaceutical treatments, especially experimental medications designed to enhance cognitive abilities. The oversight procedures would prevent future researchers from distributing untested treatments without proper safety evaluation. But the most important lesson was about the relationship between technical competence and human compassion in medical care. The infected staff had retained all the knowledge and skills necessary to perform medical procedures, but they'd lost the emotional capacity to care about patient welfare in any meaningful way. Medical training needs to emphasize the importance of empathy and ethical reasoning as much as technical knowledge, Dr. Kim said as we worked on recovery protocols. Competence without compassion isn't just ineffective healthcare, it's potentially dangerous. The recovery operations took months to complete, but gradually the contaminated facilities were cleared and normal medical operations were restored. The infected staff who received treatment were able to recover their normal emotional responses, though many struggled with psychological trauma from the period when they'd been unable to feel genuine concern for their patients. I returned to work at Metro Hospital Services, but my role had evolved significantly. Instead of just processing contaminated medical linens, I was now part of a regional network of technical specialists who monitored supply chains and service networks for signs of systematic contamination or compromise. The experience had taught me that invisible infrastructure workers like myself were often the first to notice when something was wrong with the systems that supported critical services. Our mundane technical knowledge could be crucial for detecting and responding to threats that more highly trained professionals might miss. You saved thousands of lives by recognizing the contamination patterns in those medical linens, Colonel Martinez told me during our final debriefing. Without your technical expertise and willingness to investigate unusual conditions, the infection could have spread throughout the entire regional healthcare system before anyone realized what was happening. But I also understood that the threat we'd faced wasn't unique. The same vulnerabilities that had allowed infected researchers to compromise medical facilities could be exploited by other groups with different objectives. Terrorist organizations, foreign intelligence services, or corporate entities with unethical agendas could potentially use similar strategies to compromise critical infrastructure systems. The federal authorities were implementing broader security protocols that extended beyond healthcare to include other essential services. Power grids, water treatment facilities, communication networks, and transportation systems all shared the same interconnected vulnerabilities that had made the medical contamination possible. We're developing a national network of technical specialists who understand critical infrastructure systems and can recognize signs of systematic compromise, Colonel Martinez explained. People like you who work with these systems every day and know when something isn't operating normally. I became part of that network, working with other infrastructure specialists to monitor supply chains and service networks for signs of contamination or compromise. The work required understanding both technical systems and human psychology, because many threats would come from people who retained intelligence while losing normal moral constraints. The Detroit Medical District was eventually rebuilt with enhanced security protocols and monitoring systems that would make similar contamination much more difficult to achieve. But the new facilities were designed with the understanding that technical competence without human compassion could be more dangerous than simple incompetence. Medical training programs throughout the region were revised to emphasize the importance of emotional intelligence and ethical reasoning alongside technical knowledge. Healthcare professionals needed to understand that their ability to provide effective care depended as much on their capacity for empathy as on their medical expertise. Dr. Kim became the director of a new research institute focused on the relationship between cognitive enhancement and human psychology. Her work was helping develop safeguards that would prevent future attempts to create enhanced humans who lacked normal emotional responses. The infected researchers thought they were creating improved medical professionals, she explained, but they were actually creating highly intelligent individuals who had lost the essential human qualities that make medical care a caring profession rather than just technical procedure. The network of infrastructure specialists that I joined was identifying similar vulnerabilities in other critical systems. The same efficiency and interconnectedness that made modern civilization possible also created opportunities for systematic compromise by intelligent adversaries who understood how these systems operated. But we were also developing countermeasures and response protocols that took into account the possibility that future threats might come from intelligent adversaries, rather than simple technical failures or natural disasters. The experience with the medical contamination had taught us that human intelligence combined with compromised moral reasoning could be far more dangerous than purely technical threats. The work was ongoing because the systems that supported modern civilization were constantly evolving and new vulnerabilities were emerging regularly. But now, we had networks of people who understood these systems well enough to recognize when something was wrong and respond effectively before small problems became regional catastrophes. That first night at Metro Hospital Services had taught me that the people who maintain invisible infrastructure are often the first line of defense against systematic threats. Our mundane technical knowledge and routine procedures could be crucial for protecting the systems that everyone else depended on but rarely thought about. The infected staff at Detroit General had retained their intelligence and technical knowledge, but they'd lost the human qualities that made their work meaningful and beneficial. That taught me that in any crisis, the people who survive and help others survive are those who combine technical competence with genuine concern for human welfare. The invisible infrastructure that supports modern civilization is operated and maintained by people like me, and our understanding of how these systems work is essential for protecting them against threats that more prominent professionals might not recognize until it's too late.